Okay, so here's our first video on feedback mechanisms. I'm going to be doing two videos and there's only 4 questions in both, or all 4 questions are kind of addressed in both videos. So just know that you're going to be using both of them to answer all 4 questions. So what are feedback mechanisms? Feedback mechanisms are used to maintain internal environments and to respond to external changes. So the first thing is this idea of homeostasis, which we have talked about a bit. Homeostasis is a biological state of equilibrium that results from many processes. Cells are able to respond to changes in order to maintain balance. So here's our stimulus, which produces a change in variable. The receptor then detects that change. Input is the information sent along afferent pathway to control center. The control center you can think of as just like the brain. So that's why it's afferent pathway. Then the efferent pathway is the output, which is information sent along efferent pathway to the effector. The effector is basically a response, which the responsive effector feeds back to reduce the effect of stimulus and return variables to homeostatic levels. So that's our idea of homeostasis. So how do we do that? How do we maintain homeostasis? Organisms are going to respond to changes in their internal and external environments to maintain this. They will do that by using positive and negative feedback mechanisms, which are behavioral and physiological mechanisms. So we're going to start off by talking about negative feedbacks. Negative feedback mechanisms maintain homeostasis for particular conditions. They regulate physiological processes in order to change conditions back to target value. So remember, for negative feedback, it is always going to help us maintain our targeted value, our homeostasis, back to normalcy. So some examples of this are animal temperature regulation, regulation of sugar levels, and plant response to water limitations. So you can see in our negative feedback loop we have our stimulus, we sense that, we send that information to the control center, and then we have this effector response that is going to respond directly to the stimulus. So our first example of negative feedback loops are thermoregulation. This is going to probably be the most common one that you'll see. Thermoregulation is the control of body temperature through various mechanisms in response to both internal and external changes. So you can see here that our body temperature does fluctuate a little bit, but we have this homeostatic level here that we want to maintain. So for example, the body detects that the temperature is too hot, so the effectors, remember, our effector here, is going to respond and decrease the temperature. Now if the temperature is too cold, then what's going to happen is the body will respond to increase temperature, back and forth until we get to our homeostasis. Now, it can be really confusing because a lot of people will think that this in itself is both a negative and positive feedback loop. However, this is all negative. The reason it's all negative is because it's always, whether it's high or low, returning to homeostatic levels. So how does it actually accomplish this? So here's one mechanism if we are too warm. So the first thing that can occur is that arterioles in the skin dilate, which increases the blood flow to the skin. The skin becomes warmer and more heat is then able to be lost from blood to the environment. Another thing that we can do is our sweat glands that produce sweat carry away heat energy when it changes from liquid to gas. So this is how we would reduce our body temperature. Now, if we are too cold, what we can have is the first thing is shivering, which increases the rate and number of muscle contractions, which produce heat as a byproduct. And we also have vasoconstriction, which involves the contraction of blood vessels in the skin, which decreases blood flow near the skin surface. So now that the skin is cooler, it reduces heat lost to the environment. So these, I guess, 4 mechanisms make up the negative feedback loop that is thermoregulation in animals. Another one that you'll see is insulin and glucagon, which are hormones produced by the pancreas and help regulate blood glucose levels. So the first thing we have is insulin, which is produced by beta cells when glucose levels are rise. When glucose levels are risen as a result of eating. It stimulates cells to uptake and metabolize glucose, and the liver to convert glucose into glycogen. We also have glucagon, which is produced by alpha cells when glucose levels drop. So we have, once again, 2 different things occurring for one negative feedback loop. So insulin and then glucagon, when glucose levels drop, it stimulates the breakdown of glycogen to glucose molecules in the liver, and the resulting glucose are released in the blood for use by body tissue cells. So once again, this idea of insulin and glucagon are used in order to maintain homeostatic levels within our blood glucose in the body. This is not a positive and negative. This altogether is a negative feedback loop because we are reaching or we are returning to homeostasis. Yeah. Together, insulin and glucagon help maintain homeostasis and blood sugar levels throughout the body. This is essentially what I just said. Okay, I think this is our last example. Another one which is actually really fascinating, at least I think so. Plants are able to respond to water limitations in their environment. They open and can close the stomata on their leaves, which are the openings that control the rate of water evaporation from tissues. So what can happen is these guard cells will actually open and close, and as you can see here, lower water levels increase hormone levels, which cause the guard cells to close to reduce the stomata size, which is this opening. So plants essentially can control if they're losing or allowing that loss of water in their cells, which is really amazing. So now we have positive feedback. Positive feedback mechanisms amplify responses and processes. So the factor initiating the response is moved further away from the initial point. Amplification occurs when the stimulus initiates additional response in the system. So instead of always returning back to homeostatic levels, oftentimes that change is actually going to be increased. Now it can be bad, but a lot of times it's good because it helps us do some process. For example, lactation in mammals, onset of labor, and ripening of fruit. So obviously, this is a really obvious one. Actually, so is lactation. Labor and lactation are not something that just occurs all the time. It's because of a particular stimulus. So the positive feedback basically amplifies that so that we can lactate or we can give birth. But that's not going to be like a normal thing occurring in the body. It's not helping us return to homeostasis. So that's the biggest difference between a positive feedback mechanism and a negative feedback mechanism. And if you're feeling overwhelmed by these as we go through, know that in class we're doing case studies on these that are going to allow you to research them more specifically, so that way you can feel really confident about them. So for example, lactation is the secretion of milk from the mammary glands so that a mother can feed her young. When the baby suckles on the nipple, a nerve stimulates the pituitary gland to produce prolactin hormone. This hormone then travels to the mammary gland to stimulate milk production. So now, this positive feedback loop is actually increasing that stimulus because it's producing the hormone. Okay, and then during labor, oxytocin is released, which increases contractions. As the baby pushes against the cervix, the pituitary gland is stimulated to release more oxytocin. So as you can see, once again, this positive feedback mechanism is actually increasing that stimulus. The reason it's increasing is to do some process in this example. It's to be able to give birth. Our last example of positive feedback is ripening fruit. It's such an interesting example. Ripening fruit releases a hormone ethylene, which accelerates the ripening of fruit nearby it. These fruit then release more ethylene, amplifying the process, which causes the fruit to ripen at the same time. So that's why if you've ever seen someone if something isn't ripe yet, what people will do is put a banana that's already been really ripened in a plastic bag with it, because that ethylene is going to cause the rest of the fruit to ripen. So once again, that stimulus is amplified, this release of that hormone in a positive feedback. Alterations in the mechanism of feedback often result in negative consequences. For example, dehydration can occur in response to decreased antidiuretic hormone, controls water levels. Another example, and these we're going to go in depth with all of them in class, so if you want to just write down the samples for now, we will go in depth with these. Graves' disease is an autoimmune condition where the thyroid gland becomes overactive. This results in hyperthyroidism, inflammation of the eyes, and sometimes skin disease. Once again, all of these are when there's been some sort of an alteration to that feedback mechanism, and it's causing something negative to occur. Diabetes is a condition where an individual's body is unable to effectively decrease blood sugar levels. If untreated, it can lead to damaged tissues. As most of you guys probably know, there's two types of diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is technically an autoimmune disorder, where beta cells are attacked. This results in the body being unable to produce sufficient insulin to signal glucose uptake by cells. That's why they get insulin shots. And then since the body cannot produce insulin, type 1 diabetes can be treated by regularly injecting insulin. Blood glucose monitors can be used to track concentrations of glucose in the blood. Type 2 diabetes onsets typically later in life and results when cells are unable to now respond to the insulin that the body is producing. This is the cause of deficiency of insulin receptors and is thought to be a result of poor diet. Since the body cannot effectively respond to insulin, treatment involves adjusting diet to prevent blood spikes in sugar. Starchy foods should only be eaten if they have a low glycemic index. So once again, these last things that I just covered, diabetes, Graves' disease, and these antidiuretics, are all examples of what happens when a feedback mechanism is not functioning properly in the human, and what happens because of that. Now, here are some more examples or some more links if you are interested in taking a look at those.